The People's Socialist Republic of Albania was the official name of Albania from 1976 until 1992. From 1946 to 1976 it was known as the People's Republic of Albania, and from 1944 to 1946 as the Democratic Government of Albania. Throughout this period the country had a reputation for its Stalinist style of state administration, dominated by the Enver Hoxha and the Party of Labour of Albania, and for policies stressing national unity and self-reliance. Travel and visa restrictions made Albania one of the most difficult countries to visit and to travel from. In 1967, it declared itself the world's first atheist state. It was the only Warsaw Pact member to formally withdraw from the alliance before 1990, an action occasioned by the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. The first multi-party elections in socialist Albania took place on 31 March 1991. The Communists gained a majority in an interim government. The People's Socialist Republic was officially dissolved on the 22nd of March 1992 with the first parliamentary elections, consolidation of power and initial reforms. On 29 November 1944, Albania was liberated by the National Liberation Movement. The anti-fascist National Liberation Council, formed in May, became the country's provisional government. The government, like the LNC, was dominated by the two-year-old Communist Party of Albania, and the party's first secretary, Enver Hoxha, became Albania's prime minister. King Zog I was barred from ever returning to Albania, though the country nominally remained a monarchy. From the start, the LNC government was an undisguised communist regime. In the other countries in what became the Soviet bloc, the Communists were at least nominally part of coalition governments for a few years before taking complete control and establishing out-and-out communist dictatorships. Having sidelined the nationalist Bali Kombeta, a task made easier by the ballists' collaboration with the Nazis, the LNC moved quickly to consolidate its power, liberate the country's tenants and workers, and join Albania fraternally with other socialist countries. The Internal Affairs Minister, Kochi Zox, and erstwhile pro-Yugoslavia Tin Smith, presided over the trial of many non-communist politicians condemned as enemies of the people and war criminals. Many were sentenced to death. Those spared were imprisoned for years in work camps and jails, and later settled on state farms built on reclaimed marshlands. In December 1945, Albanians elected a new People's Assembly, but voters were presented with a single list from the communist-dominated Democratic Front. Official ballot tallies showed that 92% of the electorate voted and that 93% of the voters chose the Democratic Front ticket. The Assembly convened in January 1946. Its first act was to formally abolish the monarchy and to declare Albania a People's Republic. Quote, however, as mentioned above, the country had been a communist state for just over 2 years. After months of angry debate, the Assembly adopted a constitution that mirrored the Yugoslav and Soviet constitutions. Then in the spring, the Assembly members chose a new government. Hoxha became Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Defense Minister, and the Army's Commander-in-Chief. Zox remained both Internal Affairs Minister and the party's organizational secretary. In late 1945 and early 1946, Zox and other party hardliners purged moderates who had pressed for close contacts with the West, a modicum of political pluralism, and a delay in the introduction of strict communist economic measures until Albania's economy had more time to develop. Hoxha remained in control despite the fact that he had once advocated restoring relations with Italy and even allowing Albanians to study in Italy. The Communists also undertook economic measures to expand the power. In December 1944, the provisional government adopted laws allowing the state to regulate foreign and domestic trade, commercial enterprises, and the few industries the country possessed. The laws sanctioned confiscation of property belonging to political exiles and enemies of the people. The state also expropriated all German and Italian-owned property, nationalized transportation enterprises, and cancelled all concessions granted by previous Albanian governments to foreign companies. In August 1945, the provisional government adopted the first sweeping agricultural reforms in Albania's history. The country's 100 largest landowners, who controlled close to a third of Albania's arable land, had frustrated all agricultural reform proposals before the war. The Communists' reforms were aimed at squeezing large landowners out of business, winning peasant support, and increasing farm output to avert famine. The government annulled outstanding agricultural debts, granted peasants access to inexpensive water for irrigation, and nationalized forest and pasture land. Under the Agrarian Reform Law, which redistributed about half of Albania's arable land, the government confiscated property belonging to absentee landlords and people not dependent on agriculture for a living. The few peasants with agricultural machinery were permitted to keep up to 400,000 square meters of land, the landholdings of religious institutions, and peasants without agricultural machinery were limited to 200,000 square meters, and landless peasants and peasants with tiny landholdings were given up to 50,000 square meters. Although they had to pay nominal compensation, the government took major steps to introduce a Stalinist-style centrally planned economy in 1946. It nationalized all industries, transformed foreign trade into a government monopoly, brought almost all domestic trade under state control, and banned land sales and transfers. Planners at the newly founded Economic Planning Commission emphasized industrial development, and in 1947 the government introduced the Soviet cost accounting system. Albanian-Yugoslav tensions. Until Yugoslavia's expulsion from the Common Form in 1948, Albania was effectively a Yugoslav satellite. In repudiating the 1943 Albanian internal Mukai agreement under pressure from the Yugoslavs, Albania's communists had given up on the demands for a Yugoslav cession of Kosovo to Albania after the war. In January 1945, the two governments signed a treaty establishing Kosovo as a Yugoslav autonomous province. Shortly thereafter, Yugoslavia became the first country to recognize Albania's provisional government. In July 1946, Yugoslavia and Albania signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation that was quickly followed by a series of technical and economic agreements, laying the groundwork for integrating the Albanian and Yugoslav economies. The pacts provided for coordinating the economic plans of both states, standardizing the monetary systems, and creating a common pricing system and a customs union. So close was the Yugoslav-Albanian relationship that Serbo-Croatian became a required subject in Albanian high schools. Yugoslavia signed a similar friendship treaty with Bulgaria, and Marshal Josip Broz Tito and Bulgaria's Georgi Dimitrov talked of plans to establish a Balkan Federation to include Albania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria. Yugoslav advisors poured into Albania's government offices and its army headquarters. Tirana was desperate for outside aid, and about 20,000 tons of Yugoslav grain helped stave off famine. Albania also received $26.3 million from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration immediately after the war, but had to rely on Yugoslavia for investment and development aid. Joint Albanian-Yugoslav companies were created for mining, railroad construction, the production of petroleum and electricity, and international trade. Yugoslav investments led to the construction of a sugar refinery in Kos, a food processing plant in Elbasan, a hemp factory at Rogozhin, a fish cannery in Vlora, and a printing press, telephone exchange, and textile mill in Tirana. The Yugoslavs also bolstered the Albanian economy by paying 3 times the international price for Albanian copper and other materials. Relations between Albania and Yugoslavia declined, however, when the Albanians began complaining that the Yugoslavs were paying too little for Albanian raw materials and exploiting Albania through the joint stock companies. In addition, the Albanians sought investment funds to develop light industries and an oil refinery, while the Yugoslavs wanted the Albanians to concentrate on agriculture and raw material extraction. The head of Albania's Economic Planning Commission and one of Hoxha's allies, Nako Spyro, became the leading critic of Yugoslavia's efforts to exert economic control over Albania. Tito distrusted Hoxha and the other intellectuals in the Albanian party, and Hoxha and his loyalists attempted to unseat them. In 1947, Yugoslavia acted against anti-Yugoslav Albanian communists, including Hoxha and Spyro. In May, Tirana announced the arrest, trial, and conviction of 9 People's Assembly members, all known for opposing Yugoslavia, on charges of anti-state activities. A month later, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia's Central Committee accused Hoxha of following independent policies and turning the Albanian people against Yugoslavia, apparently attempting to buy support inside the Albanian Communist Party. Belgrade extended Tirana $40 million worth of credits, an amount equal to 58% of Albania's 1947 state budget. A year later, Yugoslavia's credits accounted for nearly half of the state budget. Relations worsened in the fall, however, when Spyro's commission developed an economic plan that stressed self-sufficiency, light industry, and agriculture. The Yugoslavs complained bitterly, and when Spyro came under criticism and failed to win support from anyone in the Albanian party leadership, he committed suicide. The insignificance of Albania's standing in the communist world was clearly highlighted when the emerging East European nations did not invite the Albanian party to the September 1947 founding meeting of the Common Forum. Rather, Yugoslavia represented Albania at Common Forum meetings. Although the Soviet Union gave Albania a pledge to build textile and sugar mills and other factories and to provide Albania agricultural and industrial machinery, Joseph Stalin told Milovangelos, at the time a high-ranking member of Yugoslavia's communist hierarchy, that Yugoslavia should swallow Albania. The pro-Yugoslav faction wielded decisive political power in Albania well into 1948. At a party plenum in February and March, the communist leadership voted to merge the Albanian and Yugoslav economies and militaries. Hoxha even denounced Spyro for attempting to ruin Albanian-Yugoslav relations. During a party political bureau meeting a month later, Zox proposed appealing to Belgrade to admit Albania as a seventh Yugoslav republic. When the Common Forum expelled Yugoslavia on June 28, however, Albania made a rapid about-face in its policy toward Yugoslavia. The move surely saved Hoxha from a firing squad and has surely doomed Zox to one. 3 days later, Tirana gave the Yugoslav advisors in Albania 48 hours to leave the country, rescinded all bilateral economic agreements with its neighbor, and launched a virulent anti-Yugoslav propaganda blitz that transformed Stalin into an Albanian national hero, Hoxha into a warrior against foreign aggression, and Tito into an imperialist monster. Albania entered an orbit around the Soviet Union, and in September 1948 Moscow stepped in to compensate for Albania's loss of Yugoslav aid. The shift proved to be a boon for Albania because Moscow had far more to offer than hard-strapped Belgrade. The fact that the Soviet Union had no common border with Albania also appealed to the Albanian regime because it made it more difficult for Moscow to exert pressure on Tirana. In November, at the First Party Congress of the Albanian Party of Labour, the former Albanian Communist Party renamed at Stalin's suggestion, Hoxha pinned the blame for the country's woes on Yugoslavia and Zox. Hoxha had Zox sacked as Internal Affairs Minister in October, replacing him with Shehu. After a secret trial in May 1949, Zox was executed. The subsequent anti-Titoist purges in Albania brought the liquidation of 14 members of the party's 31-person Central Committee and 32 of the 109 People's Assembly deputies. Overall, the party expelled about 25% of its membership. Yugoslavia responded with a propaganda counterattack, cancelled its treaty of friendship with Albania, and in 1950 withdrew its diplomatic mission from Tirana. Deteriorating relations with the West. Albania's relations with the West soured after the communist regime's refusal to allow free elections in December 1945. Albania restricted the movement of United States and British personnel in the country, charging that they had instigated anti-communist uprisings in the northern mountains. Britain announced in April that it would not send a diplomatic mission to Tirana. The United States withdrew its mission in November, and both the United States and Britain opposed admitting Albania to the United Nations. The Albanian regime feared that the United States and Britain, which were supporting anti-communist forces in the ongoing civil war in Greece, would back Greek demands for territory in southern Albania, and anxieties grew in July when a United States Senate resolution backed the Greek demands. A major incident between Albania and Britain erupted in 1946 after Tirana claimed jurisdiction over the channel between the Albanian mainland and the Greek island of Corfu. Britain challenged Albania by sailing 4 destroyers into the channel. 2 of the ships struck mines on October 22, 1946, and 44 crew members died. Britain complained to the UN and the International Court of Justice, which, in its first case ever, ruled against Tirana. After 1946, the United States and the United Kingdom began implementing an elaborate covert plan to overthrow Albania's communist regime by backing anti-communist and royalist forces within the country. By 1949, the United States and British intelligence organizations were working with King Zog and the Mountainmen of his personal guard. They recruited Albanian refugees and émigrés from Egypt, Italy, and Greece, trained them in Cyprus, Malta, and the Federal Republic of Germany, and infiltrated them into Albania. Guerrilla units entered Albania in 1950 and 1952, but Albanian security forces killed or captured all of them. Kim Philby, a Soviet double agent working as a liaison officer between the British Intelligence Service and the United States Central Intelligence Agency, had leaked details of the infiltration plan to Moscow, and the security breach claimed the lives of about 300 infiltrators. Following a wave of subversive activity, including the failed infiltration and the March 1951 bombing of the Soviet embassy Especially in Tirana, the Albanian regime implemented harsh internal security measures. In September 1952, the Assembly enacted a penal code that required the death penalty for anyone over 11 years old found guilty of conspiring against the state, damaging state property, or committing economic sabotage. Political executions were common, with between 5,000 and 25,000 killed in total under the period of the communist regime. Albania in the Soviet sphere. Albania became dependent on Soviet aid and know-how after it broke with Yugoslavia in 1948. In February 1949, Albania gained membership in the Communist Bloc's Organization for Coordinating Economic Planning, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Tirana soon entered into trade agreements with Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and the Soviet Union. Soviet and East European technical advisors took up residence in Albania, and the Soviet Union also sent Albania military advisors and built a submarine installation on Sazan Island. After the Soviet-Yugoslav split, Albania and Bulgaria remained the only countries that the Soviet Union could use to funnel war material to the communists fighting in Greece. What little strategic value Albania offered the Soviet Union, however, gradually shrank as nuclear arms technology developed. Anxious to pay homage to Stalin, Albania's rulers implemented elements of the Stalinist economic system. In 1949, Albania adopted the basic elements of the Soviet fiscal system, under which state enterprises paid direct contributions to the treasury from the profits and kept only a share authorized for self-financed investments and other purposes. In 1951, the Albanian government launched its first 5-year plan, which emphasized exploiting the country's oil, chromite, copper, nickel, asphalt, and coal resources, expanding electricity production and the power grid, increasing agricultural output, and improving transportation. The government began a program of rapid industrialization after the APL's Second Party Congress and a campaign of forced collectivization of farmland in 1955. At the time, private farms still produced about 87% of Albania's agricultural output, but by 1960 the same percentage came from collective estate farms. Soviet-Albanian relations remained warm during the last years of Stalin's life, although Albania was an economic liability for the Soviet Union. Albania conducted all its foreign trade with Soviet European countries in 1949, 1950, and 1951, and over half its trade with the Soviet Union itself. Together with its satellites, the Soviet Union underwrote shortfalls in Albania's balance of payments with long-term grants. Although far behind Western practice, healthcare and education improved dramatically for Albania's 1.2 million people in the early 1950s. The number of Albanian doctors increased by a third to about 150 early in the decade, and the state opened new medical training facilities. The number of hospital beds rose from 1,765 in 1945 to about 5,500 in 1953. Better healthcare and living conditions produced an improvement in Albania's dismal infant mortality rate, lowering it from 112.2 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1945 to 99.5 deaths per 1,000 births in 1953. The education system, considered a tool for propagating communism and creating the academic and technical cadres necessary for construction of a socialist state and society, also improved dramatically. The number of schools, teachers, and students doubled between 1945 and 1950. Illiteracy declined from perhaps 85% in 1946 to 31% in 1950. The Soviet Union provided scholarships for Albanian students and supplied specialists and study materials to improve instruction in Albania. The State University of Tirana was founded in 1957 and the Albanian Academy of Sciences opened 15 years later. Despite these advances, however, education in Albania suffered as a result of restrictions on freedom of thought. For example, educational institutions had scant influence on their own curricular, methods of teaching, or administration. Stalin died in March 1953, and apparently fearing that the Soviet ruler's demise might encourage rivals within the Albanian party's ranks, neither Hoxha nor Sheffield risked traveling to Moscow to attend his funeral. The Soviet Union's subsequent movement toward rapprochement with the hated Yugoslavs rankled the two Albanian leaders. Tirana soon came under pressure from Moscow to copy, at least formally, the new Soviet model for a collective leadership. In July 1953, Hoxha handed over the foreign affairs and defense portfolios to loyal followers, but he kept both the top party post and the premiership until 1954, when Sheffield became Albania's prime minister. The Soviet Union, responding with an effort to raise the Albanian leaders' morale, elevated diplomatic relations between the two countries to the ambassadorial level. Despite some initial expressions of enthusiasm, Hoxha and Sheffield mistrusted Nikita Khrushchev's programs of peaceful coexistence and different roads to socialism, because they appeared to pose the threat that Yugoslavia might again try to take control of Albania. It also concerned Hoxha and Sheffield that Moscow might prefer less dogmatic rulers in Albania. Tirana and Belgrade renewed diplomatic relations in December 1953, but Hoxha refused Khrushchev's repeated appeals to rehabilitate posthumously the pro-Yugoslav Zox as a gesture to Tito. The Albanian duo instead tightened their grip on their country's domestic life and let the propaganda war with the Yugoslavs grind on. In 1955, Albania became a founding member of the Warsaw Treaty Organization, better known as the Warsaw Pact, the only military alliance the nation ever joined. Although the pact represented the first promise Albania had obtained from any of the communist countries to defend its borders, the treaty did nothing to assuage the Albanian leaders' deep mistrust of Yugoslavia. Hoxha and Sheffield tapped the Albanians' deep-seated fear of Yugoslav domination to remain in power during the thaw following the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1956, when Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes in his secret speech. Hoxha defended Stalin and blamed the Titoist heresy for the troubles vexing world communism, including the disturbances in Poland and the rebellion in Hungary in 1956. Hoxha mercilessly purged party moderates with pro-Soviet and pro-Yugoslav leanings, but he toned down his anti-Yugoslav rhetoric after an April 1957 trip to Moscow, where he won cancellation of about $105 million in outstanding loans and about $7.8 million in additional food assistance. By 1958, however, Hoxha was again complaining about Tito's fascism and genocide against Albanians in Kosovo. He also grumbled about a COMECON plan for integrating the East European economies, which called for Albania to produce agricultural goods and minerals instead of emphasizing the development of heavy industry. On a 12-day visit to Albania in 1959, Khrushchev reportedly tried to convince Hoxha and Sheffield that their country should aspire to become socialism's orchard.